You are listening to Salty Believer Unscripted.
This is Salty Believer Unscripted. I'm Bryan, Catherman.
And I'm Josiah Walker.
This is a podcast where we talk about various Christian things and aspects of Christianity through a biblical worldview. It might be that we talk about books or events. Actually, today I want to talk about the paper that you submitted. At the time this is going to come out, it's going to be... You don't have your grade yet.
I don't have my grade. I just submitted it yesterday.
You'll have your grade by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah.
But okay, I was fascinated to talk about this with you because you were in a biblical ethics class. What's the name of the class?
Christian ethics.
Christian ethics.
So,
Okay.
yep.
So you're in a Christian ethics class, and your final paper, you had to pick a topic about ethics. What'd you pick?
So I picked In Vitro Fertilization.
So here's what's interesting to me before we jump into that. Our listeners are probably like, old hat.
Sure.
We don't talk about that as much anymore. That used to be like a fiery topic. It was in the news. Christians were talking about it. I mean, we'll talk about why.
Sure.
But here's my question to our listeners. What was the resolve? How did it end?
Right.
What did we land on as a church? Did we come to any position? No, we didn't. Not really.
Not that I could find working on my paper.
No, we have these issues that are hot topics, and then another topic comes along, or it morphs into something more. The abortion thing gets bigger. Then you have, gay marriage.
Issues,
then you have, just on and on and on. And so what ends up happening with a lot of these things is we think about them, we talk about them, we debate a little bit, we think deeply for a bit, and then we fall victim to the next shiny debate, and we never really settle. So when you said, "Hey, I'm writing about in vitro fertilization," I thought, wait a minute. What is it? What is kind of the biblical stance, and where do we land on some of this? And it's kind of all over the map, right? So
absolutely.
Okay, I want to talk with you about it. So that's why I thought this hasn't been a topic that's been addressed very recently, but I think there's a lot of ramifications that have come out of it for today.
Sure.
Because we didn't address some of those. Probably the same with, if you think about going back to gay marriage, just gay marriage.
Right.
Now look where we're at.
Right. Things change, right? Like, even working on this paper, I was reminded of cloning, right? When we were cloning sheep.
Oh, my goodness. I forgot about all that.
I think...
Are we still cloning sheep?
Well, I don't know. Not that I'm aware of. But
now
in vitro fertilization kind of came out of that a little bit.
Now we got AI robots.
Right. Now we're dealing with AI and robots.
Anyway, so in vitro fertilization came out of the clonning or vice versa?
I think it came out of cloning a little bit. Kind of came from that, of working with DNA and genetics and stuff like that.
There was. I remember when this was, what, 10 years ago?
Yeah. Maybe.
There was like, at what point is a human cloned and clone baby?
Right.
And that's all we were talking about.
So
what the purpose of your paper was just to kind of give a survey of...
just kind of give, just pick an ethical topic and then talk about kind of why that topic is important to for the church today, or could be meaningful to the church in the future. And so that's one of the reasons I picked in vitro fertilization, is because the biblical view or stance that you could make on that is all over the map.
Okay, so like what's the range? Maybe give us one side of the spectrum to the other. Generally. There were people that were for it, people that were against it, and even in there was a wider range, right? So for the use of fertilizing eggs outside of the womb and then planting them,
right? Which is basically what it is. You take all the pieces, you put them together, you create an embryo. Those embryos are then inserted in the woman once they've been fertilized, and they've given the woman hormones to kind of
accept it and do the whole thing,
create pregnancy and that. And so there are people who say, hey, this really isn't okay, this is outside the sanctity of marriage, this is outside of traditional means for reproduction, so
all the way to like we can't even do it because you didn't do it the correct way,
right? And then sometimes there's even like 3 different people in the DNA because they're having to make up parts that are missing.
So now you're morphing and
right. So then it's got 3 parents, right? Like usually it's from the 2, and then also all those embryos, sometimes you can get like 8 to try to see which ones work. And then moms usually don't want 8 kids.
And so here's the real tricky part, which this plays out today. Are those embryos life, not life? What do you do with it?
So determining when life was.
How do you discard the embryos? What happens?
And then
do you use them to clone other people?
Right. So, if you remember the big thing of the Octomom in the 90s, was because she had all 8 embryos inserted.
They put them all in and
they all worked. So, yeah. And then sometimes those embryos that don't get used get frozen. And then a lot of times, those frozen ones, when they thaw them out, get destroyed or they're not viable.
Are they viable? Do any get thawed and they are viable? Because
some get thawed and they are viable.
The idea was like a woman's like, well, I'm not married now, but what if I go past my prime and I don't have my eggs anymore, so I better freeze them for the future? That was part of the conversation.
And then what happens if you and your spouse get divorced? Right? And
that was in the will. When do you use them? How do you use them?
And sometimes people experiment on them. I saw one article that was saying, hey, it's okay for us to do all this kind of stuff, even though it's outside of marriage, because look at Abraham and Sarai, they had a kid with Hagar and had Ishmael that way.
I don't think that was
worked.
A good thing.
And then Jacob and Rachel, she couldn't have kids, so God let him use the servant girl to have kids.
A concubine.
And I was like, I don't really think we're looking at the biblical text accurately to make that case.
And on top of that, that's even those situations, like that's kind of a surrogate mother kind of. I mean,
a lot of times, I didn't do this in the paper, but a lot of times people would link IVF to surrogacy because you could use a surrogate mother to help carry that through.
But still, man, that seems like a hefty stretch to go from there, Abraham and Hagar, to I froze some eggs that could be used by, I could sell it, probably totally legal to sell them, but deed them or do whatever. I mean, holy cow.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest arguments are, probably come back to that abortion piece, really, for a lot of people. You consider those embryos life because they have the potential to become a life form.
These are not the frozen eggs of a woman who freezes her eggs later to be inseminated, fertilized with sperm. These are actually, they're embryos. Right. We're talking about, all the parts have come together, and if you say life begins at that point, which I think most of us, if we pull back from the ramifications of what happens if we say something. If I say it, then this might lead to, now I'm talking about abortion, blah, 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 whatever. But here's what's interesting. You see it posted. You find bacteria on Mars, you call it life.
Right.
The very beginning of a turtle egg, the second it's laid, is protected. There's all those arguments. So the only reason we don't want to say an embryo is life in this argument is because of the ramifications of what that means if we want to have an abortion later. So that's a tricky ethical thing. You covered that, you kind of walked through that in your paper a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. And that's kind of why I said that this is such an important issue for the church today, is because I've forgotten the exact numbers, but people struggle with infertility issues, and look to things like IVF. So it's going to be the thing where, as pastors and leaders, you're going to have people, even just as Christians, you're going to have friends in your church who struggle with infertility issues. A lot of times because couples are waiting till later in life, as husband and wife are both working, right? So women are a little bit older and they're struggling. And
apparently it's okay for men to be a little older. I mean, what it was like Al Pacino, and I keep seeing these guys in the news that are like 80 and
supposedly
they're having kids.
He's had a kid with his 20-year-old girlfriend, but I think he's getting a paternity test to make sure it's actually his. But
yeah, there was a few, and there's somebody else that does this too. Like these guys are like. But obviously, the clock is ticking for a lot of ladies. I get that.
Well, and that was one of the things they talked about, too. One of the sources I was looking at was like men struggle, too. And a lot of times, I think the hardest thing with a topic like this is it feels taboo, right? Men don't really talk about, hey, I had issues or my wife had issues. Sometimes the men feel like they just have to go along with this because the wife really wants a kid. And they're like, okay, well, I guess whatever. And
or you're getting the building blocks from somebody else, which again, that even plays into, if that's the concern, then you have to wonder, what do you do with adoption?
Sure. And you can even adopt some of these embryos. Like, you can say, hey, well, there was an argument for, hey, these unused ones, we should put those up for adoption and use those for other people, and
so they can So it's crazy to me, though. Some of those debates were just constantly bombarding the news. There were conversations in church. I'd say there were conversations in podcasts, but when was that really playing out? Like 10 years ago?
I think so, yeah. 10, maybe 15 years ago.
15 years ago, 2012, 10, 9, somewhere in that zone, maybe? Yeah. Wow.
So,
when did they try to clone that sheep? Was Molly? Was that the name of the sheep?
No.
I don't even remember, but yeah, all that stuff had the same fervor as like the AI stuff right now. Like there's this really strong discussion of what are the ramifications, where are we going with this, how do we deal with this? So that's interesting. What caused you to choose a topic? Just had a list? Did you just have a list and you just like, hey, how about this?
This class was really hard for me because I just wanted to write about biblical stuff and pull out my commentaries and write exegetical papers. It was hard to kind of talk through big just ethical issues. But every week there was a lecture on a different one, from abortion to LGBTQ plus issues to poverty, and how the church should look at all these things.
Did they cover drugs? Did you do
drugs? Yep.
Drugs? Did you talk about any of the AI computer type stuff?
Not a lot, which was funny to me because already I felt like my textbook was dated because I'm like, hey, this IEA stuff, we're going to have to add that. But my wife and I have had our own infertility issues, and after God, I don't even know, 15 miscarriages. The doctors came to us and said, hey, your wife can't handle this. Her body can't go through this anymore. And I remember struggling as we made the decision to kind of get a hysterectomy, and there were times where my wife said, did I just stand in the way of God of having this operation done?
So this topic was personal.
For me because I had to answer those questions. And there are people in the church who are going to say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. If God wants you to have a kid, he'll give you a kid. And you just put up a big wall. You've took all the parts out so then you can't.
Well,
you've played God in your life.
Let's pull back on that. Hold on. So there are those people that say don't, the use of birth control is unethical. And it's not to say that it is or isn't, but that's where the spectrum is, sure. Right? So you kind of got to. So were you kind of working through that personally as you were thinking through those pieces?
So yeah, I think it was part of a therapeutic for me to just really work through that and go, where do I stand on this? And I think it's important as pastors and leaders to kind of be able to help counsel couples through this, because I've thought about the heartbreak that my wife and I have dealt with of not being able to have a kid. I mean, that's one thing my wife really wanted, was to be able to have a child of her own, to give birth to a child and have somebody that calls her mom. And so to not be able to have that, you kind of look for those answers of, well, God, why? Why, right. If I have this such strong desire, was I not able to? Especially when you see stories of people like Sarah, who God says, you're going to have a kid. And she goes, hey, but I'm an old woman. And he does it for her. And so I think as couples are struggling through this, because I read a thing, once again, I've forgotten the exact numbers, but the IVF stuff doesn't always work.
Right.
You're going to spend all the money, and it still might not work. Only like 30 or 50% of the time does it actually work.
It's going to do a ton.
So these couples are going to have to be counseled, because there's emotional, psychological, and spiritual stress and trauma that kind of goes through all this.
Well, there's a lot of complexity there.
Correct.
I mean, I was just thinking through, like, man, there's certain things that I go, okay. I was talking with somebody else just recently about this. In these areas of either argument or debate or ethics, you sort of have green light, yellow light, red light issues. Green, yellow, red. Like, green is like, it's good. It's always good. It's no problem. Or if you're, making an argument, like, we totally agree on this. This is, this is fine. This is obvious. Yeah. Then you have on the other side of that the red stuff. Like, yep, we all agree this is bad, or this is clearly out, or maybe in my own life, this is out of bounds. Clearly. Sure. No problem. The green. But then it's when you get in the yellow, you get in that middle space, it's so much more hazy, and you're like, wait, well, in this circumstance, well, what about, and how do I feel about? So, I sit and think, okay, you have all those eggs, they're embryos.
Yeah.
I really would put, destroying the embryos in the red light category. I just think that's ethically wrong.
Right.
That's a big problem. Can you adopt them out? Oh, okay, that sort of makes sense to me. Like, it gets far more yellow, almost green. Like, well, don't destroy them, so adoption makes sense. But then do you do medical testing? Nope. Like, all these weird. That's just tough to think through.
A lot of times these things are used for vaccinations, and
right. Stem cell stuff, was there like any of that in there?
There was a little bit, yeah. Like I said, for my paper, I had to really kind of hone it in. But just the scope of things that you could dive into research this was vast.
Right. And I don't think as Christians we need to think deeply about how the Bible speaks into our world and how God has communicated. And I think often we take these things and we just take the shallow, quick approach.
Sure.
Yep, bad, wrong, whatever. And we're like, wait, let's dig into some of the complexities and think about it so that we really land on it. So did this paper do, like, when you started this, do you feel like you had the same sort of depth and thought, or was it just like, that's interesting, it's going to be therapeutic? I mean, how did it go for you?
It definitely helped shape my my thought process on the whole thing, because there really is, like you said, red, green, and yellow areas of this process where I went into it going, hey, I know there are people who say you can't use this procedure because it's outside the sanctity of marriage and traditional conception, but I felt like, no, God's given us the technology and the ability to do this to help parents and couples like myself to be able to have kids who can't have kids. But then as I'm saying, well, what do you do with the embryos you don't use? I was like, whoa, I didn't consider that.
Yeah.
And so
what do you do with non-binary, LGBTQ? Right. What do you
open it up to those couples too? And
like, that's way out. Like, we're talking about over here. It's don't do this outside the sanctity of marriage, and over here it's like don't do this outside of what's even physically possible apart from those issues. These become huge conversations.
Yeah. So it really just became the kind of thing where the main point and the main conclusion I came to was that we need to love one another. And we need to be there for each other and not let our opinion on this matter kind of really divide us and cause tension among couples who are struggling, among Christian brothers and sisters. Yeah. And how we might view it differently than somebody else in our congregation, but we need to help walk them through their own infertility issues.
Is there anything in those red lights, though, where you would say, whoa, don't do that, that's wrong? Did you come to any of those conclusions? I won't put you on the spot, but did you come to some of those?
Yeah, the whole destruction of embryos and stuff, that was something I really had to think about, because there are doctors who say, well, that's not really a life form because blah, 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 because they're trying to justify it's
we
not
just
a
need
person
to get
yet,
rid of these,
right?
and we don't need to make this complicated.
And then just freezing them isn't the answer either, because what if you never come back to them? And so it was basically the kind of thing where I left going, wow, there's a lot more to consider here than I first went into the paper thinking about.
Because the sanctity of life is a really big deal. Yeah. And so then what you're doing possibly, this is where it's so complicated, is yes, you did the eggs, you didn't use them all, or the embryos.
Right.
You didn't use them all, but you did use some, and you're having a child, but then you got 6 others that,
so then do you have to do them all?
Like what is all that? That's really complicated. And then you have to think, like, what are the people who went through that thinking, and are you counseling them later? Do they come to conclusions like, wow, we sort of aborted our embryos, or we killed these babies for the sake of this one, or that is really complex stuff that we just never, I don't think we landed on that very well. We just moved on, right? We just moved on.
And guiltily, that's probably something I'll do too. Like, already I've forgotten half the statistics because I'm already thinking through the issues facing us today.
Right. Which the irony is, the in vitro issues are still facing us today. They're just living in a shadow of they're living in a shadow of huge issues with abortion, which maybe in vitro falls into that category with some of that. But late-term stuff, just huge issues of, the LGBTQ ideologies and these things with what's going on in the world with all of it. And even, today you can open a magazine, I forgot the name of that magazine, that says men have babies. So, like, men don't have babies. Those are physically, biologically women. But, so we're talking about that stuff, which makes the in vitro conversation seem light and insignificant, but it's not.
It's not.
It's not.
It's still significant today, and the reason we're even having this conversation, and I'm writing about it, and all the other issues that surround it, the reason we talk about these things, about ourselves, not about other animals or cloning sheep, why this matters so much, is because what we see in Genesis, that we are all created in the image of God, Imago Dei, and that's why this is important.
And does this respect that, or does it not? Right. Does this trust God? Does it not? In all kinds of areas.
Does it glorify God? Does it not?
Are we, my wife and I wrestled with some of these issues, and did some, we didn't do in vitro, but we did some other things, just that were, and you come back to, am I trusting, not trusting? Is this me like Abraham not trusting with Hagar? Or is this like the benefits of some of the medical science? I'm going to take an aspirin for a headache, and I don't say, am I trusting, not trusting?
Right.
Or I had a back surgery, or, that list goes, I take medication for glaucoma. Like, am I trusting the Lord there? Well, I trust that God made those things possible. Is it the same over here? It's a complex issue, man.
And I don't think I got all the answers in my 12 pages, but I sure tried to present something. So.
Well, that's helpful to think about. I don't know if our listeners have thought much about that. We've been talking about a lot of random things.
Sure.
It's like, wait, what are we talking about now? We went from this to this to this, but I think the common thread is we want to talk about these things in a way that doesn't just broad brush and blanket to the simplest path of least resistance. Well, good, bad. No, there's complexity, and how do we think about them? And I think that's where our conversations have been going lately. We need to think deeply about issues of ministry and issues of our Christian life and what the Bible says and how the Bible speaks into them. And this is just one more of those topics.
And as Christians, we need to be able to speak into these world issues and current affairs and things that those around us are struggling with. Because chances are you're going to know somebody who's used in vitro or struggled with fertilization
or
and
walk through
issues,
it in your church.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful.
It's something to consider.
Well, we'll have to see. We'll see what your grade looks like. We'll see what the paper looks like. But it wouldn't be a terrible idea. I used to post a lot of my papers on SaltyBeliever.com. I don't think it'd be a terrible idea to possibly either take it in pieces or take it in parts, or put the whole thing up or whatever. Yeah. I think that could be interesting if you'd be so inclined. So by the time this gets onto the podcast schedule, we're just recording out for the summer a little ahead.
Yeah.
It may be that you could find more on this at SaltyBeliever.com.
We'll see what happens.
All right, until next time.
Thank you for listening. Find more information at SaltyBeliever.com.